The next time you stand in front of the meat case and see ribeye sitting there at a price that makes you hesitate, look somewhere else, not because ribeye is bad, because there is a cheaper piece of beef hiding nearby that can give you several excellent steaks, a pile of ground beef, and enough fat to make your own cooking tallow. Most shoppers never notice it. They walk straight to the familiar package, count the steaks, see the price, and leave. I used to watch people do it every week. The interesting part was that many of them were standing only a few feet away from the cut I would have bought for myself. The trick isn't a secret seasoning, it isn't a complicated marinade, and it doesn't require expensive equipment. It starts with understanding what you're actually paying for when you buy a steak. I've spent enough years around a butcher block to learn one simple lesson. The name printed on the package can change the price far more dramatically than the piece of muscle in your hand. And once you understand that, the meat case starts looking very different. Take a boneless chuck roll. It is not a ribeye. I'm not going to pretend it is, but it contains muscles that can make remarkably good steaks when you know where to cut, what to keep, and what to remove. The first mistake people make is treating the entire roast like one piece of meat. Don't. Open it up and look at the seams. A whole chuck roll contains several different muscles, and they don't all cook the same way. Some sections are excellent for steaks, others are better ground or cooked slowly. That distinction is where the savings begin. If you're buying one, ask your butcher for a whole boneless chuck roll, preferably untrimmed. The important word is whole. When the store has already cut and packaged everything into individual steaks, you're paying for labor, packaging, display space, and convenience. When you buy the larger piece and do the work yourself, you're taking that labor back, and the work isn't nearly as difficult as people imagine. You need a stable cutting board, a properly sharpened knife, and enough room to work safely. Start at the rib end. That is where the most steak-like sections are. Cut your first steaks around 1 1/4 inches thick. Keep the knife moving cleanly through the muscle rather than sawing back and forth. The first few pieces are the ones I'd pay the most attention to. Look at the center. You're looking for a good-sized eye of muscle with fine marbling running through it. Fine, evenly distributed fat is much more useful than one giant strip of fat sitting along the edge. As you move farther toward the shoulder, the structure changes. This is where people make another mistake. They keep slicing straight across the roast, expecting every piece to behave like the first one. It won't. When the main eye becomes smaller, stop treating the roast like a uniform steak machine. Follow the natural seams instead. Use your fingers to locate the connective tissue between muscles and separate those sections along the seams. The knife should be doing the cutting, not brute force. Some pieces will become steaks. Some will become small roasts. Some will go into the grinder. That's not failure. That's exactly how a butcher gets value from the entire piece. And there is another cut you should learn to recognize, the flat iron. It comes from the shoulder and has a thick line of connective tissue running through the center. That connective tissue is the reason this muscle was historically treated very differently from the way it is treated today. The useful part is what happens after you remove that tough center. Split the muscle along the connective tissue and carefully remove it. What remains is a relatively thin, nicely marbled piece that cooks quickly. This is where an inexpensive shoulder section can surprise you, but don't make the mistake of cooking it like a thick chuck roast. A flat iron is a steak. Give it high heat, cook it to your preferred doneness, and slice it across the grain when you're finished. The grain matters more than most people realize. You can buy a reasonably tender piece of beef and make it seem tough simply by slicing it in the wrong direction. The knife should cross the muscle fibers rather than travel alongside them. That shortens the fibers you have to chew. Simple, and it costs nothing. Now let's talk about another part of buying larger cuts that most people completely ignore, the scraps. When you trim a roast, don't automatically throw everything into the trash. Separate the lean meat from the hard white fat. The lean pieces can go into ground beef. The fat can become tallow. If you have a few pounds of trim, that can turn into several pounds of ground beef depending on how much lean meat you're working with. The advantage is that you know exactly what went into it. For the hard fat, cut it into small pieces roughly the size of walnuts. Put it into a heavy pot over very low heat. Don't rush this part. You're trying to slowly melt the fat rather than scorch it. Give it around 3 hours depending on the amount and your heat level, and strain the liquid through a fine filter. Once it cools, you'll have a firm, pale fat that can be stored and used for cooking. That is something people used to do routinely. Now, most shoppers never see it happen. And here's the part that can save you even more money. Stop assuming the most expensive grade automatically gives you the best steak for your situation. When you look at beef grades, you're looking at a specific grading process, not a magic guarantee of flavor. Instead of staring at the sticker first, look at the meat, examine the marbling, look at the muscle, look at the amount of exterior fat, look at the connective tissue, and consider what you're actually going to do with it. A heavily marbled steak cooked quickly is one thing. A leaner piece intended for braising is another. The label cannot make that decision for you. Your knife, your eyes, and your cooking method matter too. There is also a simple shopping trick that has nothing to do with cutting meat. Learn when your local store marks down its beef. Most departments have a routine for products approaching their sell-by dates. The exact timing varies by store, so don't assume every supermarket follows the same schedule. Ask. Walk up to the meat counter and say, "When do you normally mark down the beef?" That's it. You may get a useful answer. If you find discounted beef that you're comfortable using, have a plan for it before you buy it. Cook it promptly or freeze it properly. And don't confuse a darker surface color with automatic spoilage. Beef can darken when oxygen exposure changes, particularly inside packaging. Color by itself isn't enough to tell you whether meat is safe. If the package is leaking, swollen, damaged, or the meat has an obviously unpleasant odor or other signs of spoilage, don't gamble with it. A cheap steak isn't a bargain if it makes you sick. That brings me to something else experienced meat buyers understand. Some of the best cuts never get much attention because shoppers don't ask for them. Hanger steak, teres major, sirloin flap, chuck flap. The exact availability depends on the butcher and the animal, but these are the kinds of cuts worth asking about. Don't just ask what cheap steak do you have. Ask what cuts do you have in the back that don't normally make it into the display case. That question tells the person behind the counter you're interested in the meat itself rather than just the familiar names. And sometimes that changes the conversation completely. Now, none of this helps if you don't have somewhere to store the meat. That's why buying larger pieces makes the most sense when you have freezer space. A large roast can produce far more portions than a normal family needs in 1 week. Package the steaks individually. Press the wrapping tightly against the meat. Remove as much air as practical. Label every package with the cut and date, then freeze it. Don't throw a pile of unmarked packages into the freezer and expect to remember what everything is 3 months later. You won't. I know because I've seen it happen too many times. The package that looked obvious in January becomes a mystery package in April. Good wrapping matters too. Freezer burn is primarily a moisture loss problem caused by exposure to air. So protect the meat. Tight plastic film first, followed by a proper freezer-safe outer layer. Write the date down. It takes less than a minute. Now we get to the biggest money-saving move of all. If you have enough freezer space, consider buying beef in larger portions directly through a local processor or locker. This is different from ordering a random frozen meat box online. You are purchasing part of an animal and arranging processing through a local facility. The pricing structure can be different because you're paying for the animal and the processing rather than buying individual retail steaks. But there is an important warning here. Don't blindly compare the hanging weight price with the price per pound of steaks in the grocery store. They are not the same thing. Hanging weight is measured before trimming, cutting, and removal of bone. Your final take-home weight will be lower. Processing charges matter too, so ask for the complete price structure before committing. Ask what the hanging weight price is. Ask what the processing fee is. Ask about vacuum sealing. Ask about additional charges. And ask roughly how much finished beef you should expect. Then do the math. That is how you find out whether the deal is actually a deal. If the volume is too much for one household, split the purchase with relatives or neighbors. A larger purchase becomes much more manageable when several families share it. And the real advantage isn't just steak. You get roasts, you get ground beef, you get soup bones. You can request specific steak thicknesses. You can keep the bones for stock. You can save the fat for rendering. You're using more of the animal instead of paying premium prices for only the pieces everyone already knows. That's the lesson I want you to remember. You don't have to stop eating good steak. You need to stop assuming the steak has to arrive in a little foam tray with a familiar name printed across the label. Learn the muscle, learn the seams, learn how the cut behaves, then buy the larger piece when the numbers make sense. Start small if you've never broken down a roast before. Buy one chuck roll, take your time, keep your knife sharp. Separate the muscles instead of fighting them. Cut your best steak portions thick enough to cook properly. Grind the lean scraps. Render the hard fat. Package everything carefully. And before you leave the store next time, ask the butcher one question. What larger cuts do you have that I can break down myself? You might be surprised by the answer. And if you've already been buying whole roasts, tell me what cut has given you the best results for the money. The interesting part of old butcher knowledge is that every region seems to have its own overlooked favorite. And there is one more technique worth learning, because buying inexpensive beef is only half the battle. A perfectly good steak can still turn out tough if you handle it incorrectly during the first day or two after bringing it home. That timing matters more than most people realize, and the mistake is surprisingly easy to make. Hash the first 48 hours. Where good beef can go wrong, here is the part most people never think about. You bring home a beautiful piece of beef. You paid less because you bought it whole. You trimmed it correctly. You wrapped it properly. Then you put it in the refrigerator and assume the job is finished. It isn't. The first couple of days are when careless handling can turn a good piece of beef into something disappointing. And the biggest mistake is usually not seasoning. It is opening the package too early. When beef is packaged, the surface and the interior are in a different environment than they are on your cutting board. If you've bought a vacuum-packed roast, don't tear it open simply because you're excited to start cutting. First, check the package. It should be intact. No leaking, no swelling, no damaged seal. If everything looks normal and you're keeping the roast for later, keep it cold and follow the storage guidance on the package. The goal is simple. Don't create extra handling until you actually need to. When you're finally ready to break it down, clean your workspace first. This is not the time to discover that the cutting board still has yesterday's vegetables on it. Wash your hands, clean the knife, clean the board. Keep raw beef away from foods that will be eaten without cooking. Then open the package and take your time. Don't start hacking immediately. Look at the meat, find the seams. Feel the direction of the muscle fibers. Look for thick pieces of connective tissue. A butcher isn't just cutting a shape. He's reading the structure. That's the difference. If you cut straight through every seam because it looks faster, you may end up combining muscles that should have been separated. And once you understand that, you start seeing something interesting. A roast isn't necessarily one recipe. It's several pieces of muscle sitting next to each other. Each one has a different job. Some want high heat. Some want time. Some want to be sliced thin. Some belong in the grinder. The knife tells you which is which. Now take your best steak portions and resist the urge to season them immediately if you're planning to freeze them. Package first, label the cut, write the date, then freeze. When you're ready to cook one, move it into the refrigerator to thaw rather than leaving raw beef sitting around at room temperature. Once thawed, that's when you can start thinking about the cooking. And this is where another common mistake shows up. People pull a steak from the refrigerator, throw it straight into a screaming hot pan, and wonder why the outside is finished before the center reaches the temperature they want. The answer isn't complicated. Thickness matters. A thin steak and a 1 1/4 inch steak do not behave the same way. The thicker steak gives you more room to develop a browned exterior while bringing the center to your preferred doneness. Dry the surface before cooking. That little step matters. A wet surface has to lose that moisture before it can brown properly. So use paper towels and remove the surface moisture. Then season. You don't need a complicated spice cabinet. Salt is enough to prove whether the meat itself is good. If you want pepper, add it according to your preference. Now get the pan properly hot. The goal is a strong sear, not burning. Put the steak down and let it stay there long enough to develop color. Don't keep moving it every few seconds. That's another habit I see constantly. People put meat in a hot pan and immediately start sliding it around. Let the surface do its job. Once you have the crust you're after, turn it. Then use an instant read thermometer if you want consistency. A thermometer removes the guessing. That doesn't mean you need to cook every steak to the same temperature. It means you know what temperature you're actually reaching. And remember, carryover cooking can continue after the steak leaves the heat. So don't wait until the exact final temperature you're targeting if you already know your steak will continue rising while it rests. Let it rest before slicing. Not because resting is some magical ceremony, because cutting immediately can release juices before the meat has had a chance to settle. Then comes the final knife trick. Find the grain. Look carefully. The muscle fibers will run in one direction. Cut across them, not along them. This is especially important with steaks from working muscles. A good piece of beef can seem dramatically tougher when it is sliced with the grain. The same meat cut correctly can eat much better. That is why I always tell people not to judge a cut from one bad meal. Ask yourself what happened. Was the cut wrong for the cooking method? Was it sliced incorrectly? Was it overcooked? Was the surface too wet? Was the meat handled poorly? Was there too much connective tissue left in the portion? Those questions will teach you more than simply buying a more expensive steak next time. And this brings us back to the original reason for buying the larger cut. You're not trying to turn every inexpensive piece of beef into a luxury ribeye. You're trying to get the best possible result from what the animal actually gives you. That's a different mindset. Some pieces deserve a hot pan. Some deserve a slow cooker. Some belong on the grill. Some should become burgers. Some should become stock. And some should become tallow. Nothing has to be wasted just because it wasn't labeled steak. That's the old butcher lesson. Know what you're holding before you decide what to do with it. If you try this yourself, start with one larger roast rather than buying an entire side of beef. Learn the anatomy. Learn how the seams separate. Learn which sections you enjoy eating. Then, if you have enough freezer space and a trustworthy local processor, you can move up to larger purchases. The money isn't really saved by buying the biggest thing you can find. It's saved by understanding what you're buying, and once you know that, the meat case becomes a completely different place. You stop looking for the package with the biggest sticker. You start looking for the piece with the most potential. That's where the real savings are. And the next time you see a cheap cut that you've always ignored, don't ask, why is this so inexpensive? Ask a better question. What does the butcher know about this piece that the label isn't telling me? That question can change the way you shop for beef. Hash the cuts most people walk past. There is another reason I like buying larger pieces of beef. It teaches you to stop thinking in terms of supermarket names. Once you start looking at the muscles themselves, you'll notice that some of the most useful cuts are the ones most shoppers never even ask about. Take teres major. It comes from the shoulder and is relatively small. Because there isn't much of it on each animal, many stores don't bother putting it into the regular display. But if your butcher carries it, ask about it. The same goes for hanger steak. There is only a small amount on each animal, but it has a strong beef flavor that makes it worth knowing. Then there is sirloin flap, sometimes sold under another name depending on the market. It has an open grain and works especially well when sliced thinly after cooking. These aren't magic cuts. That's important. A cut doesn't become better simply because somebody calls it a butcher's secret. You still have to cook it according to its structure. That's the rule that matters. And here's another thing I learned after years behind the counter. Don't let the word cheap make you careless. Cheap meat still deserves good handling. If you buy a discounted package and leave it forgotten in the refrigerator for days, you've accomplished nothing. If you buy a whole roast and wrap it badly, you've wasted the savings. If you buy a tough muscle and cook it like a tender steak, you'll blame the meat when the real problem was the method. The butcher's job is partly knowing what the animal gives you. The cook's job is knowing what to do with it. Those two pieces of knowledge work together, and you can learn both. You don't need to become a professional cutter. You only need to become comfortable with the knife. Start with a simple roast. Study where the muscles separate. When you see a natural seam, don't automatically cut through it. Try following it. Use the tip of your knife. Make small cuts. Let the muscle tell you where it wants to separate. You'll be surprised how much easier it becomes once you stop fighting the structure. Then look at the pieces you've created. One might be perfect for a steak, another might be better sliced thin. Another may have too much connective tissue for a quick cook, but could become excellent after several hours of gentle cooking. That is how you start getting value from the whole animal. And there is a money-saving lesson here that has nothing to do with beef prices. Convenience has a price. The store cuts the roast. The store trims it. The store packages it. The store labels it. The store puts it in the case where you can grab it in 10 seconds. Every one of those steps has value. If you want someone else to do all of it, that's perfectly reasonable. But if you're willing to do some of the work yourself, you shouldn't be surprised when the price changes. You're taking on the labor. In return, you get control. You decide how thick the steaks are. You decide which pieces become burgers. You decide how much fat stays attached. You decide what gets frozen. You decide what gets cooked first. That control is worth something. Now, before you start buying large quantities, there is one practical question you need to answer. How much beef can you actually use? Don't buy 50 pounds because the price per pound looks attractive if your household normally eats 5 pounds a month. A bargain sitting in the freezer for years isn't necessarily a bargain. Calculate your consumption first, then calculate your storage, then calculate the real finished cost. The same rule applies when buying a quarter of a steer. Ask questions before you put down money. Find out the total expected cost. Understand the processing charges. Understand the finished yield. Ask how the meat will be packaged. And make sure you have enough freezer capacity. A good purchase starts with planning, not excitement. I have seen people get excited about a cheap bulk price and forget the most basic part. They have nowhere to put the meat. Don't be that person. If you're splitting the purchase with other families, decide beforehand who gets what. Write it down. Decide how you'll divide steaks, roasts, ground beef, bones, and other items. That sounds overly organized until you're standing beside a cooler full of packages and 3 people are trying to remember what they agreed to. A little planning prevents a lot of arguments. And when you finally cook the meat, remember what all this work was for. Not to impress somebody, not to prove that expensive beef is useless, not to turn every meal into a butcher demonstration. The goal is simpler. You want good food without automatically paying the highest possible price for it. Sometimes ribeye is exactly what you want. Buy it, enjoy it. There is nothing wrong with that. But don't convince yourself that the only good steak is the steak with the most expensive name. There are too many useful muscles on a cow to limit yourself to 3 or 4 familiar cuts. Once you start exploring, you'll find pieces that become regulars in your kitchen. And that's when the real savings begin. You stop asking which steak is cheapest. You start asking which cut gives you the best result for the money. That is a much better question. So the next time you're standing at the meat counter, take a slower look. Check the larger roasts. Look at the less familiar cuts. Ask what came in that morning. Ask what the butcher would take home. And if you have never broken down a larger roast yourself, try it once, not with an expensive piece. Use something affordable. Make a few mistakes. Learn where the seams are. Learn how the grain runs. Learn what the fat looks like. By the second or third roast, you'll start seeing the structure before you even make the first cut. Subscribe for more interesting